Hello everybody and welcome to JTV. So over the weekend I was having a look through the newspapers. I still read those things, even though most people get their news online these days, and I saw an article which stuck out at me. And it said that a group of lawyers in the UK have written to the Guardian newspaper where they were arguing that it's unfair, or maybe even not legal or immoral for that matter, for the government, the UK government, particularly the Education Secretary that we currently have, Gavin Williamson, from basically asking all universities in the UK to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Now, what is that? What is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism? IHRA stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and they created a few years ago a document which basically outlines the parameters for what constitutes anti-Semitism. Now, my personal view, at least currently, is that I think this definition has great virtue and value. It sets out the parameters for what is acceptable within a discussion about anti-Zionism, Israel, anti-Semitism, and what is not acceptable, what should be considered anti-Semitism. And obviously, the big part that's caused controversy is what it says with regard to Israel. I think that's where the main controversy comes. And it says, for example, certain things like comparing Israel to the Nazis, or saying that Israel's foundations are racist, that those things should constitute anti-Semitism. For me, and I'm sure for many of our viewers, you can understand why it's rather important that this definition is utilised in terms of setting the parameters for debate. But they argue that this puts a sort of spanner in the works when it comes to free speech. Is that true? Is that a fair argument? Maybe we should try and be level-headed and see where they're coming from. But maybe it's not. Maybe this is just a sinister attempt to find other ways to delegitimize Israel. Joining me to discuss this is David Hirsch, sociology professor at Goldsmiths University of London, also author of Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, which you can find, I'm sure, in many bookstores, but also on Amazon, both in the UK and I'm sure in other countries as well. He is also a friend of mine and featured in a JTV documentary a few years ago on anti-Semitism in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn called Whitewash. David, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Ollie. I should tell you that I'm not a professor, actually, formally. I'm kind of working on it.
Oh, I see. Oh, so I was giving you too much of a status. Well, you're a professor in my. I'm going to call you. You're a professor in my eyes anyway, because I've learned so much from you. But I'd like to start off by talking about this definition, and then we'll get into the letter written by these lawyers. Can you briefly explain to our viewers what, you know, the reasoning behind why IHRA definition was created in the first place? What's its purpose, and why is it so important?
Well, the story is actually really interesting. It goes back quite a long way. It wasn't created by IHRA. It was created sometime before that by processes that happened within the European Union and the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, and even the agency that existed before that. The story is interesting because I think it comes out of Durban, out of the Durban process of 2001. And you might remember that Durban was an international conference against racism. It happened in the New South Africa. It was huge. It was an intergovernmental conference and also a civil society conference, and it brought together people from all over the world who wanted to fight racism. And at Durban, there was a very well-organized and quite successful campaign to say that now that South Africa was free, and now that apartheid was defeated in South Africa, that now the key and most important racism on the planet was called Zionism. And it was a huge conference in a cricket ground in Durban on the seafront. And there was swirls of all different kinds of politics going on. There were people, the key claim was Zionism is now the key racism on the planet. So forget, racism in America, forget post-colonialism, forget anything, anywhere, but Zionism is the key problem. It stands for all the other problems. It's the vanguard of racism and imperialism across the world. And this is a really bizarre and quite pernicious position. And it was pushed very hard. with it came at Durban people kind of putting up banners saying that Hitler was right, and if Hitler had succeeded, there would be no state of Israel. Included in the big swirl was kind of legitimate and rational criticism of Israeli policy. And there was this kind of atmosphere created with the swirl of all these different kinds of politics, including Islamist politics and Arab nationalist politics and socialist politics. And it was a very, very difficult environment for anyone who wanted to stand up for a rational politics. Because what it did was it designated half of the world's Jews who live in Israel as Zionists, meaning racist, meaning imperialist, meaning pro-apartheid, and all the rest of it. And so out of that was a kind of global conference which thought of itself as being kind of representative of the world. And a lot of Jewish NGOs came out of there, quite shocked and quite disturbed by the anti-Semitism that they had experienced in an anti-racist conference. And they said, how are we going to get our issues recognized and talked about by wider society? Because this notion, Zionism equals racism, is highly pernicious. And it targets not only Israelis, but any Jews around the world for whom Israel is a kind of important part of who they are. And it sets up a kind of doubt against any Jewish person that maybe they're a Zionist too, and therefore a racist and pro-apartheid and the rest of it. So this is not about people defining their own identity in their own way. This is about defining people's identity in an external and a hostile way. So that's where this idea comes from, that anti-Semitism has something to do with hostility to Israel. It comes from the fact that anti-Semitism often comes to Jews and at Jews by accusing them of being apologists for apartheid, racism, imperialism, and Nazism, etc. So the other day, for example, we had one critic, and this is kind of common to a lot of the critics of IHRA, who said, we should not include anything to do with Israel in our definition of anti-Semitism because it shouldn't be there. Shouldn't be, anti-Semitism in Britain or in America or around the world shouldn't be to do with Israel, and therefore we shouldn't include it in the definition. And of course, that is to get it completely upside down. The truth is that hostility to Israel and this kind of demonization is a significant part of the anti-Semitism that comes at Jews. And therefore, if Jews are going to define and describe the kind of anti-Semitism that they face, they're going to have to describe and define that kind of anti-Semitism which appears as legitimate hostility to Israeli government policy, but which actually becomes something much more nasty and hostile. So that's the first point, is the idea that we shouldn't add anything to do with Israel into our definition of anti-Semitism is upside down, because anti-Semites add Israel into anti-Semitism. Israel is part of anti-Semitism. Hostility and demonization of Israel is part of anti-Semitism, and therefore when we're describing it in a definition, it has to be included. So that's kind of one really simple upside down point that we see. So what happened after Durban was that a lot of the Jewish NGOs wanted to get a hearing for what had happened and what was happening to them, not only at Durban, but on many campuses and in many political movements. And it was kind of in its infancy, really. And the places they got a hearing actually were two places in particular. One was the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which at that time had been trying to set the principles and the parameters of the new Europe. Right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the end of the Soviet Union, the new Europe was sitting down with itself and saying, we're not going to have racism, we're going to have democracy, we're not going to have totalitarianism, we're not going to have people described as enemies of the people. We are going to have an understanding that anti-Semitism isn't okay. and racism isn't okay. And there will be rights for lesbian and gay people and, you know, rights for women. And the OSCE was sitting down and trying to sort out the promises for itself for the new Europe. And that's the context in which the Jewish NGOs, actually led by Britain's CST, Community Security Trust, they said what we need to start doing is collecting data, figures for anti-Semitic attacks across Europe, and each country has to take it seriously, because the first part of taking anti-Semitism seriously is counting how much anti-Semitism we have. And, you know, I guess people in Romania and Hungary and whatever, they said, well, we'd like to be part of this, but how will we know what is anti-Semitic and what isn't? How will we count? And people said, all right, go and do us a definition of anti-Semitism. And that was the history of what was at the time called the EUMC definition. It was created to help identify and count anti-Semitism, to see what was happening, see if it was going up or down. Now, interestingly, the definition itself after that kind of took on a life of its own, and people started adopting it, people started talking about it. And one of the things that happened was that the anti-Zionists, the people who said that, you know, Israel is racist and apartheid and Nazi and all of those things, they began to worry, and they began to say, we don't like this. We think Zionism is racism. We don't think anti-Zionism is racism. So there was the polarization in the world was mirrored in the polarization over the fight of this around this document, around this definition. The truth is that the definition itself is actually very, very tame, right? The definition, in a sense, is not really a definition at all. It's not, you know, people kind of want an app for their iPhone that they can put in something that somebody said, or an image, or a mural, and say, is this anti-Semitic? We cannot build such an app for your iPhone, mainly because views are so polarized. So what this definition actually does is it says, these are examples of the kinds of things that are often anti-Semitic. We've seen it, we know it, we smell it, these kinds of things. So for example, when people start comparing Israel to Nazi Germany, you look at the definition says, yeah, this is a thing that should ring your alarm bell. This is not a thing that in itself is necessarily anti-Semitic. It should ring your alarm bell, and then you should make a judgment according to context, according to what was said, how it was said, who said it, what they meant, how it was heard, what effect it had. According to all those things, you should then make a judgment as to whether something was anti-Semitic or not. So the first point about that is that the definition itself is very, very tame. It doesn't designate anything.
So just to clarify, when it gives an example, like saying comparing Israel to the Nazis, it's not saying that that is necessarily anti-Semitic, but it's saying this should ring the alarm bell.
That's right. It's very clear.
Really?
I've got the
So I thought
here.
when it's giving examples,
it says,
it's saying...
it says contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life. And it says the media, schools, workplaces, religious sphere could, taking into account the overall context, include, but not be limited to, right? So what it does, it suggests that a number of things which we know are often carriers of anti-Semitism, it suggests that they might, in some contexts, be anti-Semitic.
Doesn't that give them a get out though, by saying in some contexts?
It is a get out. Yeah, it's absolutely a get out. It doesn't tell you what is anti-Semitic and what isn't. You have to make a judgment. You have to look at the context, at what is said, how it's said, who says it, what is the effect, how is it heard, is it a joke, is it serious, are there shared meanings, you know, all of those things that we normally use to understand what is racist and what isn't. So firstly, when I think I've said firstly about 4 times now, when people say this is terrible because it is chilling to free speech, right? It is not at all, because people have the right to free speech, and what this does is it gives people a framework to make a judgment about what kind of speech might be anti-Semitic. By the way, people have the freedom of speech to be anti-Semitic too, right? But
Well, they would say not if they're going to get prosecuted for hate speech under the IHRA definition.
Well, there's no prosecution for hate speech under the IHRA definition. The IHRA definition cannot find somebody guilty of hate speech. What it might do is flag up certain things that a judge might take into account, right? But the IHRA on its own is not a law. The law is the Equality Act. IHRA gives you a little bit of help, a little bit of guidance, a little bit of knowledge. Very important now also is the EHRC report that was published about Labour anti-Semitism, which distills some of the legal lessons from the experience of left-wing political anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. So that's another very important point. IHRA is part of a framework of law and knowledge. It's not a legislation in itself. So if an organization adopts IHRA, what they're doing is they're saying, we hear what many Jewish institutions and what the Jewish communities are saying. We hear that these kinds of things are often threatening to them, and we will keep that as something to refer to in case something happens, and then that will draw our attention to it, and then we can sit down and make a judgment about it. So when people are afraid of IHRA, firstly, it's because they're not really saying what's in it. But secondly, there's quite a pernicious kind of unstated claim that IHRA will be used for all sorts of nasty things, which it's not really capable of being used for. So for example, you often hear people say, IHRA prohibits criticism of Israel, right? Now, in IHRA, it says, quote, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic, right? Criticism of Israel cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. And moreover, the specific kinds of things it talks about need to be taken in context, and you need to make a judgment about them. So why do people say it prohibits criticism of Israel? It's because they believe that it's going to be used in such a way which is against its own wording, right? And you know, racism has always been like this, right? You make policy or you make an argument against racism, and the response is, oh, we're not going to be able to say anything anymore, right? About, you know, about them or about our neighbors. And the response is really a response to a fantasy. And the fantasy is that there is a really powerful, formidable enemy which is going to use IHRA in a way that IHRA doesn't really allow, right? So underneath all of this kind of fear and panic about IHRA is a notion of powerful Jews. And that must be true because the text itself is quite harmless. As I said, the text itself is very tame. So what makes people frightened is their own fantasy about Jewish power. And by the way, the thing that the EHRC report into Labour anti-Semitism added was very, very interesting too. And I've got the wording here. One of the key things that the EHRC report added was this. It talked about types of anti-Semitic conduct that amounted to unlawful harassment according to the Equality Act of 2010. And it says this, as a type of anti-Semitic conduct that was unlawful, it says, suggesting that complaints of anti-Semitism are fake or smears. Labour Party agents denied anti-Semitism in the party and made comments dismissing complaints as smears and fake. This conduct may target Jewish members as deliberately making up anti-Semitism complaints to undermine the Labour Party. So what EHRC said was that a specific form of anti-Semitism was a kind of blanket refusal to listen to Jews who said that they'd experienced anti-Semitism. So Jews came to the Labour Party and said, I've experienced anti-Semitism. You know, somebody said this to me and this is what happened and this is how it happened. And to respond by saying, haha, we know what you're up to. What you're really up to is trying to delegitimize or silence criticism of Israel. To respond like that, according to the EHRC, is itself an anti-Semitic response. So it's a very interesting kind of progression, really. We started at the turn of the century with the Macpherson principle from Judge Macpherson after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. And Macpherson said, if a black person comes and says that they've experienced racism, then you should begin by believing them. You should begin by taking them seriously. You should take them in good faith, and then you should investigate and assume that what they're saying to you has some validity. You shouldn't begin with a kind of racist dismissal of their complaint. And EHRC now says that if a Jewish person says that they've experienced anti-Semitism, then it's actually hostile, it's actually unlawful harassment to respond to them by saying, ha, I know what you're up to, you're lying, you haven't really experienced anti-Semitism, really you're playing some Israel-Palestine game and we know what you're up to and we call you out. That is not an appropriate response. Yet that is the response to IHRA. The response to IHRA is specifically to say, we're not interested in what it actually says. What we think is that the Jewish communal attempt to create this definition of anti-Semitism, what it really is the Jewish community up to no good. What it really is the Jewish community trying to prohibit criticism of Israel. And you say, well, hang on, in the definition, it says criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. And they say, that just shows how clever it is, right? We then had Ken Livingstone, who says, if that person is Jewish, you should begin by assuming that they're lying and that they're really trying to delegitimize criticism of Israel. And then we have EHRC, which says, it just says a sort of special case of Macpherson, if a Jewish person says they've experienced anti-Semitism, you should take it seriously and not try to discount or discredit it by saying that they're liars for Israel and that they're agents of a foreign power and all of that stuff. And IHRA is part of a response to anti-Semitism. It's not the whole thing. It's not legislation. It's a resource. You know, if your institution adopts IHRA, and if at some time in the future you get subjected to anti-Semitism, you can go to the institution and you can say, this is bad according to the Equality Act. This is bad according to the EHRC report. This is specifically flagged up in the IHRA definition. And you should make a judgment about whether what's going on inside your organization is okay or not. And by the way, I mean, there are many arguments about free speech, but one of the important principles of freedom of speech is that if somebody is anti-Semitic, then an institution has a right to say so, right? You know, an institution also has the right to mobilize its free speech. Mm-hmm. And, you know, Jewish people have their right to mobilize their own free speech. So in a market of free speech, it's quite important that we should have some tools and frameworks with which we can make a judgment, some education really. IHRA is an educative document, some education to be able to recognize anti-Semitism when we see it.
Right, right. So who are these lawyers criticizing the IHRA and what would you say is motivating them?
Well, I don't know about the motivations of particular people. What I do know is that there is a really formidable campaign to disavow IHRA, right? To disavow this educative document that has been in the universities. It's been adopted by the Union of Jewish Students, and the Union of Jewish Students has come to their lecturers and come to their institutions and said, this is the kind of anti-Semitism that we experience. And we'd like you to adopt this definition in order to make it clear that you're able to recognize it, not to outlaw it, not to punish people, not for any of those things, but because this reflects our experience of anti-Semitism. And if this kind of anti-Semitism happens, if there is harassment, for example, if there's unlawful harassment, or if there's something really nasty going on, then this is part of the armory that we have to make our case. So Jewish people have gone to their institutions and said, this reflects our experience. And lots of people are really angry about that. And lots of people say, no, never. And as I said, it cannot be because of what's in the text, because the text is very, very tame and the text is purely educative. So it must be something else. It must be something else that these people are afraid of. And I think in the end, what they're trying to do is the kind of Livingston formulation writ large, which is to say that anyone who raises the issue of anti-Semitism, as IRA does, is really trying to do something else, is really trying to prohibit or silence criticism of Israel. And I think that's quite pernicious. I also think that there are some people who want to carry on doing anti-Semitic things, right? Who want to carry on designating Jews unless they disavow as Nazis, as pro-apartheid, as racist, as Zionists, right? And I think those people are afraid of IRA. As I said, ironically, they don't really need to be, because IRA doesn't kind of nail them. IRA just says, you need to watch this, and they don't like that.
Right. And from a sort of both a moral and a legal perspective, can Gavin Williamson, the UK's Education Secretary, is he able to enforce all universities in the UK to adopt this as the definition? I know the UK government has adopted the IHRA definition. Is he able to ask universities to do so, and should he?
Well, he's certainly able to ask universities to do it. I mean,
but I mean to threaten consequences if they don't.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a supporter of this government. I support universities adopting IRA because it's right, because it's useful, because Jewish students in their kind of plural organization have asked them to do it, and because it would be helpful. If the government says, yeah, IRA would be helpful, I don't really see a problem with that. As I said, because IRA is fundamentally an educative document, and it's quite a good educative document. It's not a document that should threaten anybody. And for sure, yeah, you know, universities expect to be able to run their own affairs and to have some autonomy. But universities do not exist outside of the law or outside of, you know, the normal runnings of government.
Right.
So, you know, of course, lots and lots of law regulates lots of what we do in universities. And this is actually a very sort of very, very tame example of that. And I think, you know, if the government is doing something right, which is saying that IRA will make Jewish students feel protected. I mean, Jewish students might be wrong about that. The university might adopt IRA and still not protect Jewish students, yeah? But it's a step, and it's a statement, and it's something that universities can put in their bottom drawer and we'll remember it's there. So that when somebody does come for us and say, you're a racist, you're a pro-apartheid and the rest of it, and perhaps you're a racist, you're pro-apartheid, and you shouldn't be teaching sociology. Imagine that. And then I could say, well, hang on. One of the things in your bottom drawer is IRA. And IRA might help you to think about what this means. And I might make an argument that you should interpret what has happened in the light of IRA, in the light of Macpherson, in the light of EHRC, in the light of the Equalities Act. And you should say, people shouldn't try to bully me out of my job because they say I'm a Zionist.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, David, there's a huge amount of food for thought there, and I think lots of powerful content for rebuttals to those who are saying that we shouldn't be adopting this definition. I definitely believe that it's a very important way of setting parameters for debate and discussion. But I found this discussion really, really enlightening. I'm sure many of our viewers, both in the UK and beyond the UK, will have found it.
Let me just say, Ollie, on the Engage website, if you Google anti-Semitism and Engage, there is a piece currently at the top of the blog, which gives you links to lots and lots of very important and interesting pieces about IRA. So lots of written stuff.
Brilliant. What's the website? Engage.com.
It's engage.org.uk. But if you just Google Engage and my name, or Engage and anti-Semitism, you'll find it. And there's pieces by a whole number of activists and people from the CST and scholars about IRA, which will give you a real clear understanding of what's at stake in this fight, really.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dave. We really appreciate it. And I'm sure many of our viewers are going to take a lot from this. So thank you.
Thanks, Ollie.